And it says, to what might God be calling a person who is not stubborn, but naturally peaceful and agreeable?
What is God calling? Sorry?
I'll repeat the question.
Thank
to
you.
what might God be calling a person who is not stubborn, but naturally peaceful and agreeable?
Well, in this text, like in this book, I don't see that as kind of being really a message that is brought out in this book. Really, at the end of the day, we all find ourselves stubborn with sin in our hearts that we don't want to let go of. For here, Jonah, he has this very distinct boxes of people. These are non-Israelites who are actually oppressive, so they're like enemy anti-Israelites. They must be judged. And that hatred that he has for others is the sin that God is working on, saying, this is not like me, we must change this about you. And Jonah stubbornly holds on. Whatever it is that we have in our hearts that goes against God's moral standards that we don't want to let go of, God has that same answer to us. So this is stubbornness in a bad sense. Now, the question might be getting at is like, as I started, I said, stubborn we always mean is kind of a negative thing, and in the Bible it's considered a bad thing because it's always kind of stubbornness against God. But there is, in a sense, that idea, I'm a strong-willed person, right? We say that, and all of a sudden we think differently. It's because there are moments when we should not back down, right? There are moments when we need to stand firm for truth despite heavy opposition. That is true, and God does call people, if you are peaceable, like peaceable and something else?
Sorry, just shut this here. Peaceful and agreeable.
And agreeable. Those are not bad things, especially peaceable. I mean, God even says, like in Scripture, that those who are church leaders must not be contentious, right? So, like, you have to be a peacemaker. That is part of, like from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. That is exactly the character you're supposed to have as a peacemaker. However, that does not mean bending over for things that are not truth. That does not mean allowing evil and injustice and bad things to happen and sin to happen. So we have to be strong-willed with those things that God says are good. And in that context, we are to be peaceable with our enemies so that they would understand. So I would say, like, don't be a pushover, but don't be a jerk either.
Thank you. That's well answered. Someone also texted in one more question here. This is a fun one. Jonah seems not to be showing the fruit of the Spirit. Was he really saved?
Good question. Really good question. And I think we could almost, you could debate about that a little bit. And even when we see Jonah in, I think it's the book of 2 Kings, I think, it's a little weird too. He's a little bit, he gives this kind of message that it's, I don't know. Later on, God kind of changes the game a little bit. So you wonder the whole time if Jonah's kind of a bit of a rogue prophet doing his own thing. I think the fact, though, that God is pursuing and dealing with him the way he does, I think to me sounds like God, that Jonah is indeed saved, indeed does have a relationship with God, but he is like those people. If you ever read Paul's letter, well, you should read Paul's letter to the 1 Corinthians, to the Corinthians, the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians. If you're a new believer, that is something I think one of the first books that you should read, by the way. You see that he talks about this group he calls like carnal Christians. It's like he planted the church in Corinth, and he taught them, and he left. It's like they got everything wrong. Not everything, but they started screwing up in major ways. And Paul says, like, you guys are like babies, like you're Christian, like you know the truth, but you seem to be so confused and stuck in your old ways. And Jonah's kind of like that, where it's like he's got some relationship, but in so many ways he's just not at all exhibiting fruit of that. But it is a dangerous situation if we find ourselves in that. Examples like Jonah or the carnal Christians that Paul speaks about in Corinth. If you're in that state, that's a position where you need to really ask yourself questions, because that line is very fine between that and not knowing God at all. So you must be very careful. It's not a safe place whatsoever to be in.
Yeah, I like the way you put that too, and it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card that we can just be like Jonah and don't have to worry about the aspect of glorifying God, because on the flip side of it, if Jonah did listen to God throughout this whole chapter, his life would have been more fulfilled and joyful than what he was experiencing right now. So that's something just to take in consideration, that if we are like Jonah, And it's always a game of speculation sometimes. Would this person be saved? Are they not saved? That's also not for us always entirely to know. It's interesting to see how their lives play out in the Bible, but that's something we will never fully know to, I guess, some extent until then days.
Yeah, and something you said there about how the get out of jail free card, I could just be like Jonah. When we say things like that, if you think about it, it's like passivity. It's like, I don't really have to care about God. I'll live with the way I want to live, my own sense of pleasure or whatever, my own self-focus, whatever I want to do with life, I'll do it, make it as I want. I know God, but I'm not perfect, whatever. And those kind of people, when they do that, and I've done that before. In parts of my life, I've been like that. We kind of set God in a box over here, and it's like he's kind of part of our life. And we ignore him. We put God as like on the back burner, and now our life, our material life, or our own therapeutic life is what matters. That is not, I think, what's happening here with Jonah. Because Jonah seems to be actively wrestling with God. Remember when God, in chapter 3, when God actually, relents from destroying Nineveh, Jonah's like, I knew this would happen because I know who you are. Like, I know logically, I know your character and that you would forgive, and this is what I didn't want to happen. He's wrestling with God. God is not kind of an afterthought for him, and he's just dabbling with his own desire of life. And that's very different. So